We've added list of addresses to our user object, and now when we get the details of a specific user, if I send HTTP GET request to get the details of user with this ID, I get back user details and I get back list of addresses. Let's now learn how to add a couple of more web service endpoints. One web service endpoint to get list of addresses only for a specified user. We will have a web service endpoint URL /users /user ID and then /addresses. And this web service endpoint should return a list of addresses for this user only. And if we add / and then provide address ID, then this will return us the details of this specific address. And this URL is another example of how URLs in RESTful web services are being composed. Okay, so in this video, we'll create one more web service endpoint to get list of addresses for this specific user, but without the user details. So I'll go back to my Spring tool suite, and this is my controller. So I'll scroll down all the way to the bottom and I'll add one more method, and that will be to get list of addresses for this specific user. So I will need get mapping, and I'll copy that from a different method so that I don't have to type. This is going to be HTTP GET request. This is why we need get mapping. And then we will need path ID for that get mapping. So I will copy it from get user details. Here we go. So this get mapping actually has path ID and it produces XML and JSON. So I will copy this actually entire method and I'll make changes to it. Replace this. So the URL to this web service endpoint will be the following. So that's going to be HTTP protocol, and then we will have a domain name, localhost, and then a port number. And after the port number, we have application context. So in our case, it's mobile app -ws, and then we have root resource, which is in our case users. And then we will need to provide the ID of that user. Let's say this is the ID. And to get list of addresses of this user, we will need to provide / and then addresses like this. This is why the path will still begin with the ID, because / users is specified as a root resource request mapping here. After / we have user ID here, so that will read it. Now we will need to add / and then add addresses like this. Now when HTTP GET request is sent to this URL, this get mapping should trigger. Let's rename this method to get user addresses. And now it will need to return not user rest, but it first of all will need to return a list. So that's going to be list. And this method will need to return list of addresses. Let's look at the response model, what we have here. We have addresses rest, and if I open it, it is a class that represents this address resource, address ID, city, country, type. So I will reuse it. I'll copy the name of this class and I'll provide it here as a data type. So we're going to return a list of addresses. Let's create return value. So that's going to be list of addresses like this. And let's import it. We don't need this at this moment. Let's delete this. And we can make use of user service and add code that's related to addresses into that service. But I would like to create a new service and I will call it addresses service like this. And the method that we will need to create, we will call get addresses like this. And the list of addresses that will be returned will belong to this user ID that we read from URL path. Okay, and now this get addresses method should return a list as well, and it should return a list of addresses DTO. Let's look at the DTO package, and we should have address DTO here. So I will provide address DTO as a data type of this list. Let's import this one as well. Alright, so once we create address service, we will have a list of address DTO, but we need to return list of addresses that is of address rest data type. And the good news is that model mapper that we started using here in the create user request, we started using model mapper to map class fields from one object to another. So if I bring up model mapper and look into documentation, it has an example of how to map not only objects, but actually entire list. And we will need to use generics for that. So I have model mapper org opened. I'll go to user manual, and then under user manual, I'll go to generics. And here's an example that I can use to map a list of objects of specific type. It's just in this example, the list contains strings, but in our case, that's going to be address rest object. So I'll copy this and I'll scroll down here and I'll paste this code here. Let's rename this one. So that's going to be addresses DTO. Okay, now I will need to import type token. Let's import type token from org model mapper, and I will also need to import type. And as you can see, there's so many of matches for this type, so I'll paste it here. So the type object comes from Java lang reflect package. Okay, and now I have list type, so that's going to be list type, and we are going to map addresses DTO to the list type, which needs to be of data type address rest. So this string needs to be address rest. And now the return value is going to be of address rest data type. So what I will do, I will simply replace this with the return value, and then I will return it. What I will also do to avoid exceptions is I will check the addresses DTO for now. So I'll check if addresses DTO not equals to null and addresses DTO is not empty. I'll put exclamation mark. Then I will perform the code inside of this to curly brackets like this. We have an error here, and that is map. Oh, I think we've missed the model mapper. Let's go back to this website, and it uses model mapper. So we'll need to create an instance of model mapper. Let's go back to our create user, and we will copy this model mapper code and paste it here. And we will use model mapper to map, or we can even shorten that and copy the new model mapper and replace it like this and get rid of this line. Okay, so the get user addresses method should be ready. All we need to do is to create addresses service and then auto wire addresses service into our controller class. So let's do that.